Well, I was born at Crawford Long Hospital, and my mother and daddy lived at 182 Second Avenue. I never will forget that because I always felt like twos were my lucky number on Second Avenue. And I remember that little matchbox house. It was 2 blocks from the old East Lake Country Club. We were not members of East Lake. My father didn't play golf, or in fact was working for the General Electric Company, and I was the first of five boys, and we had to struggle during those early years during the Second World War. I remembered this from that 182 Second Avenue were kindergarten. I attended the East Lake kindergarten, and it was about a mile or maybe 3/4 of a mile from our house, and I walked to school. And the only thing I remember about it was my one of my friends named Gazaway had shot off a finger shooting firecrackers. And he was a hero of the class because he had only a half of a finger. But I remember taking naps on the floor, and I guess, I was 5 years old. And I can't remember much else except that house, except it had a white picket fence around it. My mother always wanted a picket fence. And Richard was born while we lived in that house, and that was all. Then we moved when I was six years old to Kirkwood, which is 35 Rocky Ford Road. And it was an old house that had to be completely redone when we moved in. Daddy actually rebuilt almost the house. There was a fireplace in every bedroom and every room, and I guess in the house, and it had to be completely gutted and rebuilt. And it was a period of maybe 2 years while we were going through this. Richard and I slept in the same room, in the same bed, and we had the usual fights when two people live together that way. And
like what? What did you do?
well, we had trouble sometimes wetting the bed, that sort of thing. But it was anyway. It was part of growing up. But I remember the whipping I got one time. My job was to take care of the chickens, and we had during the Second World War we had to have a lot of things that we did ourselves to make ends meet and to really eat. We had a couple of cows, and we had chickens, and we had a goat. And Daddy would buy chickens and his little bitty baby chicks and put them in the pen. And I remember he went on a trip one time, and he came back, and I had let the cat in the chicken house, and all the chickens, or most of the little baby chickens, were dead. And so he was going to give me a whipping, and he asked me to go get a hickory stick to whip him with, and I came back with a rotten log, a rotten stick that would break as soon as it hit something. And he thought that was so funny till I got away without getting the whipping. So, but that's just one time. I had many more. But the old
Richard,
remembrance
you
at Rocky Ford Road was we worked in the garden, and we had a couple of goats, and my mother was called Mama Rose, and she just didn't like those goats, and my father named one of the goats Rosa after her, and she never forgave him for it. And I think the funniest remembrance I have of Rosa was one night in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, she's waking up my dad, and she says, Bob, there's some burglar or something trying to get in the house. Well, it turned out to be Rosa on the front porch walking around. So that's one funny story I remember about Rocky Ford Road. But it had a big front porch with 2 swings on it, and I guess I stayed there until after I finished college. I used to milk Rosa, and one time I milked her, and apparently hurt her, and she kicked me in the face, and it was just like a rivet going bap 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 bap. And that's the last time I milked Rosa. But I had to milk the cow. I can't remember the cow's name. Daisy, I think it was, but no, Daisy was a calf. I can't remember the cow's name, but I milked a cow from the time I was 9 until I was 16 years old. And I hated that job worse than anything in the world. And they used to kid me about I was the best milker around to try to get me to do the job because I always got more milk. What I was really doing was adding a little water to it every time to maybe make it look like I was getting more milk, and I got caught at it, of course. And anyway, we had we played baseball with the guys that boy across the street named Bobby Copeland. And I remember he had some friends that would come over and we'd play baseball. Well, I got a crook in my nose from one of those baseball games in the pasture. We'd play out in the pasture where the cows ran, and I got hit in the nose I was pitching, and I got hit in the nose with a line drive that this guy hit, and that was almost ended my baseball career. I remember that pasture also because there was a big old hornet's nest as you walked into the pasture or through the gate that you went into the pasture, and we'd have fun throwing rocks at the hornet's nest and then running and lying down. Well, one time we didn't go fast enough, and I got 20-something hornet bites on me, and it was kind of a sore rear end and the rest of my body. But Rocky Ford had lots of memories. Richard and I used to be given duties of working in the garden, and I worked fast and tried to get through with mine because I hated it so bad, and Richard would go along slow and at about half the pace I did, and then he would think at the end that I should help him finish his because and we'd get in fights. We'd get in fights down in the ground, on the ground we'd plowed up or pitchforked up about who was doing the most work. But anyway, one other memory I have is we were about 7 years old, I guess, and Richard was, I think, 16 months younger than I was. And one day we were trying to see who could put the most rocks in their mouth. And I remember that my mouth got stuck and I couldn't get the rocks out. And that was sort of traumatic and a little claustrophobic, but they finally got the rocks out.
How did they get the rocks out?
I don't remember. Mother got them out, but we were crying and carrying on. But another time that Richard had swallowed a straight pin, and we were going to take him to the doctor, and Daddy asked me, he says, go back and check the barn to be sure that the barn door is closed, because the cow would get in there and eat the feed of the hay. Well, I went down to check the barn, and it was summertime, and I was barefooted, and I was coming back. A wolf rat came out and bit me on the foot, and so they had to take both of us to the doctor's office, one for rabies and the other one for swallowing a straight pin. Well, it did not turn into rabies, and I didn't have to have the shots, but it was sort of traumatic for them at that time. Richard had another occasion where he swallowed a nut, and he had to continually for weeks eat nothing but bananas and oatmeal, and had to check his stool every day to find out until he finally passed both the straight pin and the nut. But he'd have to eat bananas. They made him eat bananas and oatmeal and soft things, anything they thought would encase the object that he had in his stomach, and he'd have to check his stool every time to be sure that it had passed. It took maybe a week or so, but he passed. But I never felt sorry for anybody in my life. My dad bought a place in the country, which they later moved, and it was called, my mother named it the Wilderness because it was so far out. And Richard was very allergic to poison ivy, and they had a fire on the property, and he went down to help battle the fire, and the poison ivy through the smoke got all in through his body, and he was very, very close to death for a long period of time, and had to, in the summertime, he'd lay on the floor with a fan blowing across him with calamine lotion from one end to the other, and I don't know what he took internally, because the poison ivy was all through his mouth and nose and I guess inside. I remember 2 times that I was with my grandfather, and this is when we lived back on 2nd Avenue, but I don't remember much about my grandfather because he died when I was 5 or 6 years old, but I remember going out to his farm one time to help him pick strawberries, and I remember him whipping me because I wanted to come home and I didn't like it. It was hot, and I guess had a tantrum, and my granddaddy whipped me. But the other time I remember is him pretending to be Santa Claus. He came over and he had a Santa Claus just kind of front or apron type thing on, and Richard and I got up under his skirt saying, we said, "This is not Santa Claus, this is Granddaddy." And I remember only my grandmother very vaguely. I remember her coming out to 2nd Avenue and sitting on a lap one time. And I do remember the old house that they lived in, which was at 146 Hurt Street, which was back in the old, I guess, sort of society section of Atlanta at that time, called Inman Park. It later became a hippie area, and but in recent years it's been restored, and some of the places are very nice over there. But I remember that old house, and I used to have dreams about that old house all the time being haunted, and they had a dream that there were tunnels all through the attic and all through down, and I'd try to run from the ghosts and everything through those.
That's funny. I wonder why. I wonder why. Why ghosts?
I don't know. I have no idea. But
how
anyway,
old were you when your grandparents died? I mean, you knew them both, right?
my grandmother died first, and
This is on your mother's side, right?
On my mother's side. My grandmother died first, and she I think I was 4 or maybe 5 years old when she died, and my grandfather died when I believe it was 6, if I'm not mistaken. He didn't live too much longer after she died, maybe 2 years longer after she died.
What about Cecilia?
When my father had only one sister, and her name was Katie Lou, and Katie Lou and their mother, Sis Emma, lived with us for a good while we were on Rocky Ford Road. In fact, Sis Emma lived there until I think she died. She later moved to a little town called Mableton that my father had bought a house for. She and a friend of hers named, all I remember is Lizzie.
Violet.
No, Lizzie was her name, and she and I used to go out to visit them in the country, and I remember her making biscuits and having biscuits and jelly and that sort of thing. But that was the first time I ever was exposed to chitlins, and she used to cook those.
What are chitlins?
Chitlins are the
Vegan trolls.
intestines of pigs, and they're the worst smelling things I'd ever smelled, and I'd get just as far away from the house as I could when she was cooking them. But they used to think they were sort of delicacies. That's more. Mother Dear was my mother's. She was my great grandmother, I guess. Yeah, she was my great grandmother. She was mother's grandmother, and she was a feisty lady. I mean, I remember her favorite expression. I'd do something wrong, and she said, "Young man, I'm gonna jerk a knot in you." And she was well known for her assertiveness and her good cheer too. She was a friendly person, and everybody liked her. She was sort of a matriarch of the family But the way I remember Mother dear was that they used to have not sewing parties, but they would have canning parties where Daddy would grow all this fruit, vegetables in the garden, and they'd can all of this stuff. They'd get these Bell fruit jars and bring them home, and then we'd have all the neighbors in to peel peaches, or family in to peel peaches or peel apples or whatever they were canning, and Aunt Josie, and who was mother's niece or aunt, I guess, mother's aunt. They would and Mother dear and a lot of and even some of the neighbors would get together and they'd have a canning party, and I remember peeling those peaches and listening to their gossip, and boy, they had a lot of it. I do remember one of their canning parties or sewing parties or something and I heard them talking about Gone with the Wind, because that was 1939 when Gone with the Wind came out, and I was only 8 years old. But Mother and Daddy didn't believe. They were very, very strict Baptists, did not believe in even going to the theater at that time, dances or anything like that. And these ladies would talk about Rhett Butler and Scarlett and everything, and Mother said, "Oh, you can't go to that movie." And they said, "Boy, they wouldn't miss it for anything in the world." But she was old-fashioned. She better change her religion. Mother and Father, and we all were members of the Kirkwood Baptist Church, and we were required to go to Sunday school and church on Sunday, and Sunday night BTU, I guess they call it. Then we would go. They even had us going to prayer meeting on Wednesday night. We were in the RAs and all these other organizations which you had to go to during the week, and I guess we were somewhat rebellious of it because we were forced to go to so many different things. And I never will forget the first time I ever went to a dance. I had to actually walk out of the house to go to the dance. They did not approve, and it was a school dance, and I guess I was going despite whatever they said, so I walked out and went. But anyway, next door to us lived my first little girlfriend, her name was Marceline, and we used to talk over the fence as I'd go to milk cow. She and her sister, her cousin Pat, she lived with her cousin Pat because her mother had died when she was very, very young, and her father was a salesperson someplace, and he didn't have any place for her to stay, so she lived with them, but we'd talk across the fence as I'd go to milk the cow. And I remember we couldn't go to a movie because I wasn't allowed to go to movies, and the only place we could go was to bowling. And we'd take a streetcar bowling to Decatur. And this must have been when I was 11 or 12 years old, 13 years old, something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, they later moved away up north someplace. I remember he was with Pepsi Cola Company, I think, and they never came back. They came back when I was in college, I think, and she married a lawyer that later became sort of friends of ours. The place where we lived up at Big Canoe.
What'd she
I
look
hadn't
like?
seen her in 35 years, and I had a tap on the shoulder at chapel one morning, and she says, "You won't remember me, but I was Marceline Turner." I hadn't seen her in at least 35 years at the time. But anyway, well, as I said, you had to,
Hello.
you couldn't
Just fine.
go to movies, you couldn't
No,
go to
I haven't.
dances, and of
Haven't
course they
even
were
gotten the
very,
link. Have you sent me a message?
very
I'm trying to get
objectionable
up
playing
and-
cards or
It's-
bad language or anything like that. They were very strict, and then I think a lot of our discipline became because of their religious beliefs. Now, they mellowed a lot in the latter few years, but I felt like I had to break all the ice. Well, when I was about 16, I guess, I started, I painted our house. I learned to paint and painted our house, and And then I painted the house next door, and I made extra money doing that, and ended up, I worked my way through Emory painting houses. And I told someone one time that I was in business 10 years before I made as much money as I was making in college as a painter after I went to work with Aetna. But
Really?
in high school, I remember going to Murphy High School. Went to Kirkwood first grade, and that was first through the sixth grades at that time with grammar school, I guess you'd call it. And I remember some of the teachers and some of the impressions I had when I was at Kirkwood High School, or Kirkwood Grammar School. Bob Swan, one of my friends, we met in the first grade, and he lived on Howard Street. Right after we became lifelong friends, as a matter of fact, still see each other. And he became a doctor, and we went to Emory together. We went up the Eagle Scout together. Something else, I got in the Boy Scouts when I was about 12 years old, and was very enthused with the program, and put a lot into it, and would go to Bert Adams Boy Scout Camp, which is now Vinings, Georgia. And I love camping and going out, but because of the lack of funds during the war, we had to throw paper outs, and I had my first paper out when I was 9 years old. And I had a wagon, and I had to pull that wagon 5 miles. And then the first thing I did when I was 10, I'd made enough money to buy me a bicycle with a big basket on it. And so I carried the baskets on me. I had about 100 papers that I delivered. It was the start of my, I guess, business career, and I guess I worked ever since the time I was 9 doing something. But I guess by the time I was I remember 14, we got Daddy had to have extra money. His salary was frozen during the war, and we got a Constitution route, which was the early morning paper, and we had about, as I recall, 500 papers, and he and Richard and I would deliver papers in the morning, and always appreciated sleep because we never seemed to have any sleep. And we'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'd usually get back about 5 and try to go back to sleep until about 7, and then get up and go to school. So sleep has always been a precious commodity because of that early paper out. But we threw that paper out until the time I started to college. In fact, I was throwing a paper out and a journal route at the same time over probably 2 or 3 years.
A paper route and a journal route?
The journal was the afternoon paper, and the Constitution was the morning paper. But I had a journal route in the afternoon, and I'd help with the paper route, or the Constitution route in the morning. Back when we were about 8 or 9 years old, Richard and I, I don't know who it was, people named Keith lived next door to us, and Mr. Keith introduced us to the fine game of badminton. And we started out, and some way or another, I became the best player in the neighborhood, and as a result, I still play to this day. But we built a court in the backyard, and we had moved a lot of dirt, but we had a court, and we had a line marker that we marked the court off, and we had it as regulation, I guess, as you could get it for an outside court. And but that was the start of my badminton endeavors, and we used to have a good time with it, and we played in high school, and then I didn't play much until later on, but that was kind of a start of sporting activities as far as I was concerned.
Yeah,
When I was in
you're really athletic, are you?
when I was in high school, I went from Kirkwood Grammar School to Murphy Junior High School, which was then I think it was the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, and they used to have a junior high and then a senior high school, and the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades were the high school classes. But I started at Murphy High School, and when I left there, I went to Old Boys High School, which there were only 2 high schools in Atlanta boys' schools, and that was Boys High and Tech High, and one girls' school, which was Girls High. And they had a commercial high, and they had some other schools outside of the city of Atlanta. In 1946, they changed those three basic schools to 26 Atlanta schools, and of course I don't know how many there are now, but that was the changeover. And so I went back from Boys High back to Murphy High School, which was on Memorial Drive, and where a lot of I guess my memories start. I was out for football at old Boys High School, and I was in a crack battalion in their ROTC unit, and we won some division deal in marching and that sort of thing. I remember that one time. And at Boys High, I was out for football, but I was working. I had to throw that paper out in the morning, and I was trying to keep grades up, and we'd have to catch the streetcar home and transfer downtown. And the old high school, Boys High School, was where Grady High School is now. And so you had to take a streetcar to downtown and then out to Boys High, and I wouldn't get home till 8 or 9 o'clock at night and very tired. And so I had to drop out of football, but I went back to Murphy. I started running track, and I ran cross country, and I ran track, and I ran the half mile and the mile, and won a few medals and that sort of stuff in events that we had. But I never went back to football except sandlot ball, we used to call it, and I had my own little team in the neighborhood there. We'd play other neighborhoods, and of course had our uncoached group would have our share of injuries, and I remember several guys having to go to the hospital and everything because of getting hurt in these sandlot ball games. But yes, when I was in high school, in junior high school, I played saxophone, and I've played the tenor saxophone, and we played in the high school band, and we'd play at PTA meetings, and we'd play at some of the sporting events and that sort of thing. And I never will forget one time we were playing at a PTA meeting over at Whiteford High School, and we were in our uniforms, and I'm blue and white. I never will forget these uniforms. And Richard, my brother, played the French horn. And well, we had some firecrackers. It was around, I don't know what time of the year it was, but we had some firecrackers, and we were out in the yard shooting these firecrackers, which was against the law or regulations. And well, we heard the police coming, so we ran back in the building and got our seats in the band and had put all the firecrackers in the horns, though they wouldn't be found. Well, it ended up that the police drug us out of the band and took us home. That was a little traumatic, finding the firecrackers in our horns. Of course, we lied about it and tried to get out of it, but it didn't work.
What did your parents think of coming home with guns?
Well, they weren't very happy, and I don't remember exactly what punishment was given, but it wasn't a very pleasant time. But,
All right. Well, tell me about the
How about piano?
the barn. The what?
You played piano.
Oh, that's right. But okay. Well,
I did play the piano too. I played the piano from the time I was 9 until I found girls, which was about 16, I guess. And I used to play. I took from a lady named Miss Peel, who lived down on Boulevard, and she thought I had a lot of talent, but she just really didn't know. I played classical music, and I always wanted to play popular stuff that people were interested in, but I never could get anybody to give me instruction in how to play chords and popular music. I know the reason I started the piano, that Katie Lou, which was Daddy's sister, I had wanted to play an accordion. I remember I was at Boy Scout camp one year, and I must have been 12 years old. And well, maybe I'm younger than that, I guess. But I'd heard somebody play an accordion, and I liked it. And so I always wanted to play the accordion. And they told me, Kay Lou and Mother and Dad told me if I would learn to play the piano, that they'd see that I got an accordion. Well, I learned to play the piano, but I never got the accordion. So I never did learn to play the accordion. But anyway, I did play until I was about 16, and then forgot most of what I knew. We had a two-story garage that Daddy had built, and we turned the upper floor of that into a hobby shop. But basically, we called it an airplane club, and we would make these model airplanes, and we'd finish up and spend 2 or 3 weeks making one of these balsa wood and tissue paper type airplanes, and just spend all kind of time. And I was very proud of them, and display them and so forth. But Richard thought it was funny to take them and set them afire and then fly them out the window while they were on fire. So some of my best work was burned up as the flying flames. But anyway, that we had that club for 2 or 3 years. This was after I was in college. I went from old Murphy High School to Emory, and joined the fraternity over there, Sigma Nu fraternity, which my uncle Henry Maddox had been, and I guess my great-grandfather had been. My grandfather had been at Mercer University, had been a Sigma Nu. So they encouraged me, and I joined the Sigma Nu fraternity there. And this was later on, after maybe I'd been there 3 years, but back when we were younger, Richard and some of his friends used to go to East Lake and get balls at night. They'd go swimming and get golf balls out of the water. I really never went with them, but one night we were at the fraternity house, and one of my friends named Bob Wester had gotten hold of some white lightning from North Georgia. And so we all had to try it out, and we were feeling pretty good. And my roommate was named Hugh Burgess, and he had just gotten back from Korea. He'd been in the service in Korea, and he'd just gotten back, and he had this brand new Pontiac convertible. And boy, it was the prize of the fraternity. All the other cars were wrecks. But he had this fine new automobile that he had used, I guess, with his severance pay or whatever he got. Anyway, we decided that it would be a good idea to drive all the way from Emory to East Lake and go searching for balls. Well, we parked the car on a side street and went to one of the lakes at East Lake and took off our clothes and started searching for golf balls. Well, we got a few golf balls, but here comes a security guard, and we have to get out on the other side of the lake and run back to the car with no clothes on and go all the way back to Emory in the nude. And we're just lucky we didn't get caught by the cops. We're afraid they would have gotten us for not only imbibing, but for trespassing on the East Lake Golf Club. That was at Atlanta Athletic Club at the time, but it was called the East Lake Golf Club.
Not to mention indecent exposure.
Indecent exposure, yeah.
Well, how did you get back in the dorm?
We weren't in the dorm. We lived in the fraternity house, so we just drove back to the fraternity house.
What's your first? Do you remember the first time you met Mother? What did you think of Mother when you met her the first time?
Well,
I don't know if it's fair to ask with her sitting here.
that was an experience.
Wait, hold on one sec. Hold on. What was an experience?
Well, I was a sophomore at Emory, and Emory was not co-ed. I mean, there were no girls at Emory except nursing students. They had a few nursing students there, but Emory turned co-ed the year after I left school there. But we'd have to get our dates came from either people at local locals like me knew in high school, or from some of the from Agnes Scott College, or from some of the other girls' schools that were in the area. Hearts, I remember, was one name of one of the schools, and I can't remember the names of the others, but. And we'd go up sometime to Bernal, which is a little girls' school up in Gainesville, Georgia. But our dates had to come from like that, and we had a friend named John Wally who knew this girl that was going to Agnes Scott, and her name was Virginia Cliff, I think it was.
No, Connie Ormsby.
Virginia Cliff was who he knew. He had a good date with. But anyway, he got this girl to get dates for Bob Wester and I at Emory, at Agnes Scott, and we were going over to some reception they had, so we fortified ourselves a little bit before we went, and so we got over there, and we had to go through a receiving line, and found out that Tippi had 2 dates. I was second date. She had a date with the Guatemalan ambassador's son. Well, we played tag for a little while, and finally I ended up, and she accused me of wanting to get her in the bushes the first night we were there. But anyway, it turned out she didn't exactly like me because I was too aggressive, and the only reason she would date me is because Connie wanted to go with Bob Wester, and that's the only way Connie could get out was on a double date. So we ended up dating together. And Connie had some good friends of her parents here. Rima and Barra Burnham, who he ran the Belt Gallant store in Decatur, and they used to spend the night with them sometimes, so we could stay out later than 11 o'clock or whatever the curfew time was. But so that's the way we kind of started our relationship. And
when did you know you wanted to get married?
Oh, I don't know. We kind of went steady. I remember we got pinned I went up to visit her in North Carolina, up in Lincolnton, and she was. I remember that's when I pinned her with my Sigma Nu fraternity pin, and that was a big thing then. You pin somebody, and that meant that you're not supposed to go with anybody else or something. But that was 1952, I guess, or 51 or something. Well, that was at the time of the Korean War, and I was in a Naval Reserve squadron. We joined the Naval Reserve. Richard and I did. We had to get approval from our parents to join because we were under 18 or something at the time, and so this was before I even started at Emory. But we joined the Naval Reserve, and we went up in a squadron out there. And then when the Korean War got serious, I was in Emory. I was a sophomore, I guess, in Emory, and they called me to. I got a letter from the draft board saying that I had to come take a physical and examination, and that I was subject to the draft. So I went and did this, and I thought I was leaving. It was a transport squadron. We thought we were going to be leaving right away, but my grades at Emory were good enough. My attendance was not good enough in the reserve to keep me out. If you were 90% attendance, you could stay in the reserve and not have to go. My attendance wasn't 90%, so but my grades in school kept me out, so I did not have to go. But I was all prepared to go to Korea and did not have to go. But I stayed in the reserve for about 8 years, and then got discharged honorable.
Well, what about weren't you were kind of wild and fast, weren't you, for a guy in college?
Who, me? No, Tippi thought so. She thought that our fraternity led pretty wild life, and I guess maybe we did have some wild times. But I never will forget that she said at the parties I'd leave her to go dance with everybody in the place and leave her with a friend of mine named Bruce Wallace, who would drink bourbon out of a fruit jar, and and get absolutely plastered. And then when the dance was over, she said, "You only danced with me 2 or 3 times and danced with everybody else in the place." Well, we did have some pretty wild parties, but that was part of fraternity life at that time. That's the way all of them did that way, I think. Back when we were 12 or 13 years old, we decided to enter the soapbox derby. And that was where you made your own racer. And at that time, as I remember, you couldn't spend over $10, maybe plus the wheels. And the wheels cost maybe $5.95 or something like that for the wheels. And the wheels were pretty standard. You'd buy the wheels and then you'd make your racer. And we made this racer I had a sort of a wood frame, but then we would use like paper mache. We would cover it with newspaper with flour paste and put coats and coats and coats of that on there, and then painting. And part of it was the design of the car and that sort of thing. And I remember that first race, Richard didn't get in but the first day of the race, they had it on Boulevard. I remember Boulevard out near the federal prison, but had a long steep hill. And I made it to the second day, and I won my first race, and so I got to go the second day, and we took my racer home because we were going to put this some kind of oil on the wheels and really work them out and make them go. And we got home and never did do it, and went back the second day and got beat. But anyway, it was fun, and we got our picture and everything in the Atlanta papers as watching 2 brothers build these old soapbox derby cars. But,
It's funny. I hear you talking an awful lot about you and Richard. I guess because you guys were pretty close in age and you grew up together pretty well.
We were 16 months apart difference. And,
how far was Nolan from you?
Nolan was about Nolan was maybe 2 or 3 years younger than we were, and then Milton came along, and Milton was about, I think Milton is 8 years younger than I am. And then Henry was the youngest, and Henry was 14 years younger than I am. He was the youngest, and of course, the story about Henry.
What?
Very entrepreneurial and got got killed about 5 years ago.
He was a wild guy. But anyway, I think that's enough for today. That was great. Got me 45 minutes, Daddy.